welcome to the last step that keeps you away from lunch. And it is a pleasure and a responsibility to keep the conversation as lively and as ongoing as any other exchange this morning. Some of us have already had the opportunity to speak. I only do a very brief introduction, sharing with you that we have Sage and Andreas and myself, you know, but we have Lanna, who is the only one who has not had the opportunity to speak yet, and so the first floor is yours. But before you get to have your first words, let me set the tone again. I would like to explore with my fellow panelists again this idea of scaling towards the new normal. If we take the new normal of impact as the future of our economies, how do we get there and what would it look like? And as a first take, we would basically, from each of our experience, take a bet. Where is the most critical piece that gets us moving towards that new normal, towards that assumption that impact 5 years from now, 7 years from now, will be the standard consideration whenever an allocation is made. Lanna, what would you hope for, or what would you expect will be one of the key drivers?
Yeah, but first let me very quickly introduce myself. My name is Lanna Idris. I've been 16 years in banking and then swapped to the non-profit side as a former national director of Amnesty International, and after that for a large child rights organization, the CEO. And when you send that question, I find it very difficult to pick. But I think my main point is, and we discussed that before, that we have to think beyond. Fits probably very much with Sage as well. What do I mean by that? I give you an example. Last year, I had 7 floods in 2 weeks. I had 7 humanitarian appeals all over the world and had to react with humanitarian aid. This flooding causes a lot of costs, and I want to give you 3 examples. One is the sweet water is not captured. So, for example, last year in Somalia, we had the situation that we had several floods, the whole sweet water was lost, and we had to buy water for the people, which is crazy. Second one is the costs of the humanitarian intervention itself. So we all know, and we know that for decades, that this is the most expensive one. It's much more expensive than development aid. It's much more expensive than any kind of intervention, for example, on the labor market, etc. The third one, and this is what we discussed before, is how do we think beyond? The costs of the following migration, which is following. So it is a political difficult matter, but just imagine you would calculate the cost of Frontex into a product. And we're not doing that currently. And I do think one of the main reasons why we're not doing this is that we do not have the experts always at the table. As I used to be a banker, I could follow the argument very well with changing the narrative for the target group. But I would like to close with that I would also like to challenge that if you keep changing the narrative, a lot of people are not going to understand you anymore. We have asked the German population last year if they actually understand what we are talking about when we're talking about social impact investment and development work. And the number of the population is rising extremely fast, which just answer, I do not understand that. This is too complicated for me. Talking about scaling and mass market, I think that's an answer we have to give.
And it is, by the way, a conversation that I hear institutional asset owners discuss when they speak about their client, especially when they speak about retail clients. Impact has not arrived to their retail client yet. It's a huge educational opportunity, but also responsibility in introducing the general public to this market. Now, Sage, you have tried that educational huge task. You have tried to, as in your think tank work, in your in your activities to make the case. You have tried that educational task. Where would you find, from your point of view, the hope lies, or the key driver for moving towards mainstream is lying?
Am I on now? Okay. As I talked about earlier, I definitely think there's an investment in narratives. I think a lot of narratives that haven't reached the general public in America, probably more so in Europe. You guys are familiar with the term circular economy here. We've never heard of that over there. I think in terms of where the fundamentals can provide some load-bearing support, I do think insurance and reinsurance is an interesting opportunity here, because their business model is based on understanding that the climate risk, right? Like risks like that. And I'm more specific than impact. And so when you're seeing insurers pull out of markets or dramatically reprice infrastructure and other assets, that forces the investor to deal with the fundamentals in a way that like wouldn't be there if we were fully subject to the political whims of right now. So I do think that's providing some load-bearing support and some realism for folks. And so I think that's also why we're seeing more private capital funnel into things like climate solutions, because even though there might be this broader discourse, the fundamentals are still there, and people still have to, at the end of the day, answer to the dollar sign.
It's an observation I have in passing by, that on this panel again, the ones we speak about are not represented on the panel. We have two, if I speak of the impact market, we have two representatives who have more the sort of the demand side in mind, and forgive me if I'm phrasing Sage and you, Lanna, in this way. And we have two representatives who are more on the infrastructure side, like Andreas and myself. But Andreas, you have a role also, at least in advising and working with investors directly. So where would you see the drivers? Where does the energy come from to get us to the mainstream situation?
Yeah, I mean, you said the ambition that it should be in a lively discussion. Unfortunately, now we all have the same perspective here, but hopefully it's nevertheless interesting for all of you, because I think we all come back to the narrative. At the end of the day, it's a question of what kind of narrative we're having in the broader sense when it comes to sustainability and impact. So thanks, first of all, that you're all working in that field. And now coming to your concrete question, I think the relevant point is when we are reaching really the retail market, and you mentioned that. For the time being, it was really mainly family offices, institutional investors, etc., who could doing real impact investing. And this is the reason why I really, really loved joining Deutsche Nachhaltigkeit last year. Because, I mean, we are the ones really driving impact investing and bringing it into the retail market. And this has huge advantages, and it's really needed out of two reasons. One thing is we just need the capital. I mean, we heard about the need for more capital to finance the transition, to be resilient, etc. So we need also the capital from the retail market. This is one point. But I think even more importantly, and I already used the phrase of democratization, even more importantly is we have people now out there, and now we have, I think, 25,000 people in Germany already who invested into the Deutsche Nachhaltigkeit, our bond. So yes, they participate as it's really also financially attractive, 10%. Annual return is good. It's really good, and it's quite competitive also to other opportunities out there. But even more importantly, so now we have people sitting in the rural areas of Germany, and all of a sudden the narrative changes, because now sustainability, impact is not something in a bubble discussed in Berlin. It's something which is tangible. They can see that they can make a financial return, and they have stories to tell. So my uncle in Sauerland, in the rural area of Sauerland, all of a sudden is talking about impact investing and sustainability in a positive way. And this is why I think it's key that we are now bringing impact investing into the mainstream, and it also will stabilize our societies.
Probably the uncle was converted by the nephew, I'm tempted to say, because there is a trust and credibility opportunity here.
That's true. I mean, of course, we have to prove that we are doing that. But to be honest, at the end of the day, 10% were convincing, not me.
But now let me explore. You rightly pointed out that we may have a lot of unanimity and of agreement on this panel, and maybe even in the floor of this whole meeting. But let me therefore not do what I was tempting to do, that is look for the happy notes and say where did you see an experience in each of your backgrounds where things are particularly encouraging. But let me first explore the other side. Where did you see a conversation that you felt was particularly challenging and difficult to make the case for impact, where despite all the economic evidence, we all agree that there are direct visible economic consequences if impact is ignored. We all agree that it has direct consequences for the business models of any economic activity, and yet it still seems to be ignored by quite a good deal of players in the markets. Why so? Where does this come from?
Shall I start? I challenge also Andreas a little bit, if I may. I had a conversation with Arnold Schwarzenegger last year, and it was pretty challenging. And and he had a point. Maybe it's like embedded in his persona, but he was coming on that theme, we are making things too complicated. Yeah, and that it needs to be actually much more buzzwords which people can understand. I'm going back to that subject. And he forced me in using the word pollution. Yeah, because he says like for 20, 30, 40 years, people understand what pollution is. And they don't want pollution. And you have to make it that simple. Now, I'm usually not a person who likes that so much, but he had a point, but I also found that challenging because I was thinking, and I'm curious what you say about it, if we really make it that simple, yeah, we are not, reducing the problem, yeah. But as you said, you want to send positive messages. That is probably a combination of both. Now, the second conversation I had was really, really challenging, was with a very classical, like from my life before, investment banker, who actually had that. I had like a 10 minutes, like we have to invest in defense. And I just couldn't get my foot back into the discussion. I think these are the two biggest challenges conversations I had in this field last year.
Sage, in your think tank, you mentioned earlier on you were not a classical think tank in addressing policy, but in addressing the public. Yeah. So, your take.
I do agree that we need to demystify some of the language, and I think pollution is one of the best terms that we need to start leading with again. And I always just kind of come back to this idea that like a politician's first job is to get elected. None of us are politicians necessarily, but in order for us to have the ability to implement all these agendas, we have to get elected in the first place, right? So if whatever works with people, we should do a ton of message testing and we should lead with that. What was the other point that you had there that was really interesting?
I don't know, but I spoke about the guy who just wanted to talk about defense.
Yes, and so to that end, I always just come back into this and that like I don't want to be like antagonistic, but it is just true that like the political right of all Western countries has done a really good job at investing in narratives and flooding the zone. And so their ideas are popular, it's easy to find them. And so what we need to do is like an attempt at flooding the zone, and then there's angles to it. And so defense, what I talked about earlier was energy security. You know, right now with 20% of the world's oil capacity being offline, and we are releasing emergency reserves of oil. This is, we haven't seen a crisis like this in 5 decades. What are you talking about defense? You're not talking about security. So we need to defend ourselves against the global supply chain shock that is being dependent on other people. And I think even Europe, having swapped out dependence on Russian natural gas, they're now looking at they're now dependent on American natural gas. They prided themselves on having diversified, but really they just swapped landlords and are much more susceptible to the whims of the American president that changes every 4 years. And so it might require, yes, a trade deal with China to go and get really high quality and affordable solar panels and electric cars and stuff. Once you have that in your country, though, it's yours. You need an infinite supply of oil, though, and that means you need global cooperation. You need no wars in any of the regions that matter. You know, there's lots of ways to tie this into something like defense.
First of all, I don't think that we disagree. You asked what is the biggest challenge, and here I'm also changing my head. So I'm also the chair of the Association on Impact Investing in Germany, and due to that, I'm also involved in political discussions. And what I sense is that all of a sudden, impact investing sustainability equals left-wing politicians, and that's not the case. It's even more relevant from conservative parties, because I mean it's about really having a long-term perspective, being also economically successful, etc. But this is a real challenge that all of a sudden sustainability is just perceived as being a political statement, and this is not the case. And this is where I'm really very intensively working on, that it becomes a more rational perspective. And again, that goes back to the narrative, and it goes back to that we are also having to have a big movement in society so that everybody wants to be part of that, wants to be part of a sustainability, wants to be part of a impact investing movement. And this goes back to that we have to prove that we are successful with that, and that they have the opportunity to be part of a positive future perspective. And I think, again, this gathering, I think, is a good example that we have the possibility to showcase the examples how we can build a better world, not only due to the wish and our values, but also due to the opportunities there.
I have to say I like the pollution statement. Not because of Arnold Schwarzenegger who said it, but because it hints to a kind of hidden elephant, the white elephant in the room, and that is who pays the bill. The pollution is just a case in question of externalized cost. And impact is a conversation about who is ultimately going to pay the bill of those externalities. Let me say this provocatively. And the battle about impact is a battle about who is ultimately going to pay those bills. The investors in the current traditional economy themselves, in terms of a loss of value of their companies, because all this cost is internalized, and then their business models will look fundamentally different, or the world accepts that the cost is continued to be externalized, and then all of us are paying the bill. All of us as citizens of our countries, of this planet, wherever we are. Are we in total agreement again?
Yes.
One could say that impact investors are better investors. We're incorporating the real fundamentals.
Yeah, but I do think there's a little bit space in the product design, if I may say so, because there is not the full range yet, in my opinion, put into the products. Yeah, and especially when it comes to, for example, the labor market. Yeah. I'm missing products which pick that up. Yeah, also the prevention of high costs of retirement, etc. In the global south. Yeah, that's a huge field. So I do think there is a little bit more possibility on the product design. And this is, again, you need to bring different people from different areas to the table. That's very important, I think.
And that may also mean that the SDGs are not a nice wish list from which we can just pick the one that is most convenient for our business plan, but the SDGs are a standard for everyone and everything. And unfortunately, if you're doing perfectly well on life below water, you may still be confronted with challenges in terms of the labor markets or other SDGs. The prosperity SDG, I've seen in more special analysis that companies that are doing wonderful work in the water SDG, SDG 6, are at the same time failing on SDG 1, which is prosperity. Why? Because their products are extremely expensive and are only serving very high-end markets. So scalability of the solution very limited. So I would make a case that this is an invitation to not only do cherry picking in the SDGs and always choose the one that is most convenient for your business plan, but be reminded they are representing the planet and society, and you cannot divide them in little pieces of the cake that you prefer to eat first.
Just one quick comment on that, because that's so relevant. So that means when we are doing impact investing, we always have to base this on our values. And that differentiates us from a classical investment theory. We are just looking at risk and return. This is something you can also delegate to an analyst or even to an AI tool. But as soon as you are entering the room of impact investing, you first have to understand and make clear to yourself what kinds of values are relevant for you, and based on that, you're doing the investments. And that also makes transparent that you might also enter up with trade-offs, that you might rank one impact higher than another, and that's completely fine, but make it transparent. And again, this is why it's so relevant to become an impact investor based on your values and your own preferences.
Now, I'm mindful of lunchtime, and I'm mindful of existential needs. They are also part of the SDGs. So in concluding, I deviate a little bit from what was planned by asking all of you just one question. And because we have limited time, it is a question that you can only raise your hand or don't do it. You realize that on this panel we had more agreement than we had hoped for and less controversy than maybe could have been a conflict to get us further. Are there any of you in the audience who clearly expressed disagreement with that unanimous picture that we have just painted? Any real, unfortunately I can't ask you to explain why, but does anyone strongly disagree with the picture painted? Would you like to add a sentence?
It's about turning impact investment mainstream. The word mainstream scares me because mainstream is not what it should be. I would call it turn the mainstream to the alternative. That's the only thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
What I would say to that is I think that what success looks like for this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is what we saw with internet companies. It used to be a travel agency. Now, you can't be a travel agency unless you have a website. So the distinction between internet companies and non-internet companies is kind of fungible now. What we're hoping to see is that it won't be a question of whether your company incorporates impact or not. It's a question of how well you do it and how well you've adapted to the changing conditions, to different agricultural conditions, to changing, insurability of coastlines, because that's going to determine your literal success as a company or existence.
Andreas, the last word? Each of us, but...
The last point. I just wanted to answer to...
A 5-year question. Are we, what are we concluding in how we get to that impact is unavoidable? Impact is the new normal.
Again, by not using the word impact and using something else. And I thank you very much for the point with the mainstream. I think that's very valid. And it is, I think I would use the word participation and have the barriers to participate, lower them. This is our job to do in the next 5 years for the products and also for any kind of possible investment. If we manage to lower the barriers, I think something very similar to Sage example is possible.
Okay, then I have to add one more thing.
Yes, please.
Just throwing one more word, which it just really hasn't been come up so far into the discussion, trust. Because we really are in severe situations in the societies as we are lacking trust in so many different areas. And I think by looking at real investments based on values and being successful with it, and this goes back to impact investing, we can also restore trust into institutions, into politicians, because they are also able to bring the right regulations into the game, etc. So trust can be also restored by doing real investments and really solving the issues we are facing out there.
Final word. I think in 5 years from now, we will no longer have a conversation at any panel like this about whether we have impact or mainstream. We will have a conversation whether the transformation towards a livable world has really gained momentum or not. Thank you.